Welcome to Public Speaking with Peter George. Do you want to be calm, confident, and credible every time you speak in public? Then stay tuned as Peter and his guests discuss public speaking tips, techniques, and tactics that help you increase your impact, influence, and income. Here's your host, Peter George.
Before we get started, I have a question for you. Would 52 public speaking tips help you to become a more engaging, more confident, and more successful speaker? Then get your free tips at petergeorgepublicspeaking.com/tips. That's petergeorgepublicspeaking.com/tips. Now, to our episode. Do you employ storytelling in your business life? If so, do you know how to make your stories more effective? And if you don't use stories when presenting, is it because you don't know the value or you don't know how to develop them? Whether you use them or not, you want to listen to the advice Neil Gordon shares in this episode, including the benefits of storytelling and what you can add to help your listeners understand and remember the information you share with them. Neil works with executives and thought leaders and has helped them get six-figure book advances, be seen on shows like Ellen and Dr. Oz, and double their speaking fees. Prior to becoming a communications expert, he worked on the editorial staff of Penguin Random House, where he worked with New York Times best-selling authors. Neil has been featured on Forbes, Fortune, Inc.com, and NBC Palm Springs, and is a VIP contributor for Entrepreneur. Hi, Neil. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Peter.
Neil, storytelling for business is a huge topic right now. How important is it for people to tell electrifying stories rather than the ho-hum ones they often do?
When I first started as a consultant many years ago, I was in a discovery process with a gentleman who was trying to write a book proposal. And I suggested that he start the proposal with a story instead of some kind of general overview, some generic abstract, like at the beginning of a scientific study. And he liked the idea. And then I saw the proposal sometime later. And all he did at the beginning, he followed my advice, but it was just a story between him and another guy walking down a path at a conference. And that's all that happened. It was technically a story because he's describing events that happened in the past.
Right.
But that's all he did. And this is what we could call, in your words, a ho-hum story, because the larger mistake I see in when people try to tell stories for business, that happened to be a book example, but even more specifically in the public speaking arena, is that they edit out or leave out the most critical element. There's one ingredient in a story, whether it's for business or in another context as well, but we're speaking about business here. So with business, when we go through life and we're trying to run our business and we're trying to do things, get customers, keep customers, work with our coworkers and stuff, if we told a story about a day in the life of our work and just everything happened as it should, would that be of any real interest or value? Probably not. So what do we do? What's the antidote to the ho-hum story? A story that features the unexpected, the moments we didn't see coming. This is what creates an electrifying story.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Like an example from the public speaking arena, there is a TED Talk. It's technically a TEDx talk. It's got tens of millions of views. It's by a man named Sean Aker, and the title is The Happy Secret to Better Work. And he starts the talk with a story about how when he's like 7 or 8 years old and his little sister's 5, and they're playing around in the top bunk bed in the bedroom, and she falls off the top bunk bed and lands on the floor on all fours. And he said, "You know what this means? This means you're a unicorn." Because he didn't want her to freak out and start crying and he would get in trouble for neglecting her. So he convinces her that she's a unicorn, and she just gets up and not hurt and she's fine. But it's the falling off the bed that made that a valuable story and made the audience laugh so much when he responded to it. And why is that so important for a story in business? Because when the unexpected happens, it forces us to adapt. We need to change gears. We need to go differently in our way forward than we were before. And that adaptation leads to the lesson. And the lesson is what the takeaway is for our audience. And that's why that's so electrifying to them.
Why do you think it is so many of us miss that?
Admittedly, engineering a story that really shows us stopped in our tracks is a more vulnerable act than showing us always in control or everything going as it should. The unexpected has that shadow underbelly, that dark underside, that it's, oh my God, what am I going to do next kind of thing. Even a momentary lapse in being in control can be a little difficult. Just today, Peter, I was on Facebook and someone I'm friends with but don't really know that well. We just have a lot of common friends. She did something I made sure that I complimented her on this too. She told a martial arts story about how she had been accidentally kicked in the throat and she couldn't breathe. And she would go on to lose the competition. It was a competition. She lost the competition, not because of that penalty, that foul, but just because the other person trained 8 hours a day and she didn't. And the entire thing showed her in a compromised, vulnerable state. Getting kicked in the throat and not being able to breathe is a harder thing to deal with than totally kicking the other person's butt and rocking it out the whole time. So why is it hard? It's riskier, it's more ambitious, it's more vulnerable to show us confronted by the unexpected and needing to adapt.
Makes perfect sense. When we're in front of others, we want to be the expert, if that's why we're there,
right?
Or look successful. Now, many of us, when we're up in front of others, we're challenged to communicate complex ideas. How can our listeners convey those ideas in a very simple way?
You might remember, and many of our listeners might remember, the film Moneyball with Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill.
The Oakland A's.
The Oakland A's, exactly. In the early 2000s, they were this really small market, low cost organization, and they had a pretty bad track record. They couldn't compete with the Yankees, who had a payroll 3 times the size. And how are they going to do it? And so Brad Pitt is a real life person, and he's meeting with Jonah Hill, who's a fictional character, early on in the movie. And Jonah says there is an epidemic failure in how most baseball management is running their teams. And he says what they think they need to do is buy players, but what they actually need to do is buy runs. And that this is what everyone's doing in a false way, and this is what everyone needs to do, becomes a very simple way to present what we call Moneyball, which, I mean, the character that Jonah plays has an economics degree from Yale. It's a fictional character, but let's say the real life counterpart of that person exists, who has that kind of Ivy League level knowledge about economics and baseball and all of that. There's a lot of complexity to it. But what he does is he provides the simple idea. We don't need to do this. We need to do this. And as a side note, in real life, the A's went on to break the American League record for the most consecutive wins that year that they portrayed when they first utilized this Moneyball technique. So you could use the benefit and the evidence of its effectiveness to demonstrate how to get the idea across. But when you're trying to trailblaze, when you're trying to get the word out and no one believes you, what do? And so if we look at what Jonah said, the simplest way to get to the heart of our idea is to distill it all down to a 1-sentence recipe of a single action that leads to a single outcome. I call it the silver bullet. And almost every one of the top TED Talks has a silver bullet. When you read a nonfiction book on the Kindle and you could see the aggregate of all the highlights of like the sentences people love the most, the ones that are most highlighted are the silver bullet-like statement. And we can look at what Jonah said as an example. It's a cause and effect sentence. If you want to win at baseball, you don't buy players, you buy runs. It's not the only way to express a complex idea in a simple way, but it's one way. You just juxtapose it with the typical flawed ways that most people go about solving the problem. You don't want to do it this way. You want to do it this way. And what's the simple action that you can take that's a departure from what else is out there that doesn't work as well?
That's a great example. And the thing is, it's nice and easy. I think we often, and you can tell me if you agree, when we're trying to simplify, we often complicate the simplification.
Even Peter, when I teach people this technique and I say it's a single action that leads to a single outcome, and they come back to me, oh, I think I've written my silver bullet. And they still provide like 3 actions in the sentence. They're still trying to complicate it because admittedly, distilling all of your expertise down to a single action can be a bit daunting. However, it does make a difference. And the reason why is that the most effective silver bullets, the most effective distilled ideas leave no room, like no need for, not room, but no need for interpretation. If you have 3 actions, then you're even just interpreting. Do I do all of them equally? Is it one, then the next, then the next? Do I do them in order? Does it matter? All of these questions, they're not necessarily conscious questions in the person's mind. It could just be like this unconscious thing that's just kind of waiting around in the background in their mind, but it leads to more friction in their mind because they're starting to ask other questions. As opposed to if you have one action that leads to one outcome and it doesn't require any interpretation, you could just know it, you get it. You're suddenly empowered without any other context. You just get what you're supposed to do at that fundamental level.
Let's move on to another idea. I know you talk about speakers finding their true voice and personality. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, I actually will start with people who suffer from imposter syndrome. And this happens a lot, especially among corporate speakers who aren't there to be a speaker. They're there because it's part of their job or they're required to, or their managers told them, I can't go to this. You have to go in my place or something like that. And so there's often, they're fraught with this anxiety that they're not worthy of being standing in front of a bunch of people and providing information or content as an expert. And that's not the old, like corporate speakers don't corner the market on imposter syndrome either. Professional speakers go through this as well, of course. But given all of that, what I find is an overlooked way to recognize one's voice is to think about the stories that demonstrate the effectiveness of whatever it is you're there to speak about, and identify how you interpret those events. Now, I can break that down a little more precisely. Let's say you are an executive coach. You're an executive coach and you teach executives how to step into their most natural gifts and talents in the corporate environment and to marry their job with their gifts. And you have a client who was a senior management level. They weren't quite a VP yet, and they're a director level, and they spearheaded a project that they had never taken on before, and it utilized their gifts in a way they never had before. And they're like, oh, this person's got it. And within 6 months, they were promoted to VP, right? And that's a very clear cause and effect, very clear. I helped this person to find their power and their gifts, and now they were promoted, and now they're more influential in the company. So you could tell that story. And where does your voice come in? You can share that story and then provide like emotional context. How did you respond? How do you interpret your client's response? How do you interpret their coworkers' responses? Because emotions are what they are for each of us, but how we interpret those emotions becomes very personal to us. And so we can find our voice by marrying our competence, our expertise, our unique take on how to solve a problem, like helping an executive, with the emotional context of that help. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. You know, you bring up imposter syndrome. In your experience, do you frequently see people with imposter syndrome that aren't progressing in their career as quickly as they normally would?
I remember talking to a young woman. She was relatively early in her career, and she was doing administrative support at a college in Boston. I remember we were at her sister's wedding, and she was just kind of moving around the room, taking care of everybody. She noticed it was last call at the end of the wedding, and she got a bunch of beers so that she could hand them out to people. And she was just so good at taking care of people's needs in the moment and being one step or several steps ahead of everyone else and making sure their needs were fulfilled. And I looked and was like, don't you realize how naturally you would fit into working a live event? That the ability to anticipate needs in the moment is a valuable marketable skill that people want. And the next time she didn't tell me this, but I found out that she was hosting events at a brewery like a year later or something like that. And she's moved on in other ways and stuff. But I see this all the time, that people have a preconceived idea of their value because that's what they see in the world around them as other people their age are doing this thing. And who am I to do anything other than the most standard, typical career path? And they never even have an insight that they have a gift that could so align with who they are and what they're good at and how they can impact the world. So a lot of times the imposter syndrome just comes from a lack of clarity about what your value is.
I see it holds so many people back, and they don't want to do something, afraid that they'll expose themselves. And unfortunately, that means whatever it is doesn't get done. That's a shame.
For sure.
Speaking about doing things well and bringing value, as we're talking, I noticed that you are incredibly gifted at using analogies and metaphors. Is that innate in you? Did you build that skill?
I love that question, Peter. I've never been asked that before. And of course, thank you for the compliment. I remember when I was about 22, I was at a party at a friend's apartment, and everyone else was just getting drunk. And I was hanging out with one friend who was relatively sober, and then another guy who I wasn't friends with, but we were both at the party. And I just posed a question: what is it that makes, the drunk guy made a comment that a common friend was super smart. And so I didn't know I didn't read the room, frankly. And I wasn't very good at that back then. But I asked the question, what is it that makes somebody truly a great thinker? What is one of the best indications of a very intelligent mind, of an active mind? And he just left the room and had no interest in it. And my other friend, I don't think he was in the state to talk about that sort of thing, Neil. And so it was kind of a funny moment. And I would develop, hopefully, a little more sensitivity to situations like that moving forward. But I will admit that was the origin story of me suddenly asking that question to myself and hearing the way certain people spoke and thinking that analogies, being able to take existing schemas, like digested mental construct that people have, and marrying it with a new mental construct that they don't have. And doing that would be, I don't know if it makes you the smartest person, but it certainly seemed like a valuable skill to have. It certainly seemed like a way to make communication into more of an active service. And so sometime within about a year or two of that, I was just obsessed with thinking of things in analogous terms. And frankly, Peter, I just feel very seen right now because no one's ever made that comment to me. And it's not until you asked me the question that I realized that it's been about 20 plus years of me developing that skill and now feeling recognized that it went somewhere. So that's great.
It certainly did. And that is a skill. When you can take something complex and make it simple, when you can take the unknown and break it down to something that's familiar, that's a skill. And I think it's one that we don't use enough. And I think you're very gifted at that.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. And as a tip for our listeners, there's a show from I believe it was the 2000s called Numbers, which the premise was there was an older brother who was an FBI agent. And the younger brother was like a world-class math genius. And the only math genius I've ever heard of, he's a fictional character, so of course they could do this for him, where each show he had a very complex mathematical concept that he then presents as an analogy. And I feel and because you get one pretty much every episode, I think, it's a really nice way to see that process in action on repeat like that. And so it shows us that it's possible.
I watched that very show. My wife and I were both fans of it. And you're right. He would take that very complex thing and present it to the FBI if this is how it's playing out. You go, oh, I get it.
Exactly. For our listeners who might be entrepreneurs who have like a very tech heavy solution, and there might be people who are primed to know that stuff, even if they're not engineers themselves, that they can think like an engineer. But then there are lay people who really don't speak like that, and they're not going to engage with the content because they just don't have any context why what the tech person is saying is relevant to them and all of that. And so these kind of analogies become incredibly helpful for making that more accessible.
When you say that, it made me think of, this goes back years. I was speaking to a tech person. I was having a problem with my computer, and he said, well, you need this. And I said, you are speaking so far over my head. You've lost me. And he thought for a second. He said, this part right here. Yeah. He says, that's the key that unlocks the door. That's why it has to be precise. I'm like, oh, okay, I get it.
Yep.
I understand. Yep. And I never forgot that.
It's a great example in and of itself for what we're talking about, Peter, but it also is a reflection of stickiness in that it stayed with you all these years later. You remember it all. How many experiences do we have that we don't remember? So this is a really good demonstration in real time right now during our conversation of how valuable it is to explain things in that way.
And I don't think it's as difficult as many of us make it out to be.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people think that I'm against information and like breaking down your message or your content into multiple parts. I'm not against that. In fact, if you're writing a book or if you have a 5-day seminar or even a 3-hour workshop or whatever, you're going to have information. You're going to have more bite-sized chunks of information to provide to your audience. My point is that it'll be all those different parts will be more accessible to them if you first distill it down to something that's more of an umbrella. It encompasses everything moving forward. And through the lens of that larger umbrella statement, then you do that. My umbrella statement, my silver bullet for all of my work is very simple. It's that effective communication values the recipient over the sender. And this relates to what I said before about communication being an act of service. That's really what I'm encouraging people to create as a shift, as opposed to, let's say, demagoguery, where a politician might use communication to manipulate the populace to get elected. And that manipulation, for me, is just not really going to get us where we want to go in general. It might serve their needs, but it's not going to serve all of our needs.
No, that's often what gives the term persuasion a bad name.
Right. The manipulation is the problem. I like to say my work is persuasion with heart, or persuasion without everyone needing a shower afterwards.
I like that. And that's what true persuasion is.
Yeah. Something that's in their best interests as well.
Exactly. Neil, what final tip do you have for public speakers that'll help them accomplish what they're doing?
This is a tip that's more specific to live presentations as we go back to those and things open up again. The mistake that so many speakers make when they're introduced at, let's say, a conference and they step out on stage and everyone's applauding and the MC leaves the stage, what they do is that they say, oh, thank you so much for being here. Oh, it's so nice to be here. And thank you so much. And oh, isn't so-and-so great? And how about a nice round of applause for so-and-so who just introduced them or something like that. And they visit and they try to be friendly and entreat themselves to the audience. But the start of a speech is sort of like the start of a race, in that a race has that moment of tension at the beginning where it's on your mark, get set. And right between get set and go, or the gun going off, is that high point of tension, because anything can happen from then on. And you don't know what's going to happen, but you're anticipating it. So there's all this tension baked into the start of a race. And similarly, when you walk out on stage, there's all this tension because the talk could be anything. You could be anything to that audience. It's a completely blank slate. And so instead of squandering that tension by smoothing out, saying, oh, it's so nice to be here and thank you so much, you just start with a story. Like a client of mine years ago started her talk with, a longtime friend of mine didn't know what to do, and then described her friend who was in this moment of crisis in her life. And everyone was held rapt at attention from the moment she started speaking. You'll have the audience eating out of your hand from as soon as you start speaking, as long as you don't squander that tension and sound like everybody else, but instead own it and say, I deserve to be here. And if you listen to me, your life will be better. And taking that kind of ownership will be instantly captivating to your audience.
Much more compelling than it's a pleasure to be here.
Exactly.
What I say to my clients is, how often have you ever read a magazine article where the author of the article starts off with, "It's a pleasure to be allowed to write in this edition of this magazine. I'd like to thank the publisher, the editor." No, it doesn't happen that way.
No. Acknowledgements in a book, usually, sometimes they're at the beginning of the book, but usually they're at the end. And either way, they're separate from the book itself.
Right.
Just get into it. Give them a reason to pay attention, and they will.
Where can our listeners learn more about you and the services you provide?
Simplest way is to find me on my website, neilcanhelp.com, Neil, canhelp.com. And a fun thing to check out is to take that instant captivation tip and make it more personal to your personality. And so I have a speaker quiz, and you get one of 5 animal personality types. And when you find that out, you can learn some tips on how to be not just captivating, but captivating in your particular way with your particular style.
Neil, thanks so much for being with us today. You've shared a lot of ideas, great ideas, wonderful analogies, and I'm sure they'll truly help our listeners.
Well, I appreciate all of that, Peter. It's been a delight being here, and thank you very much.
Hey there. This is a reminder to sign up for your 52 free tips at petergeorgepublicspeaking.com/tips. petergeorgepublicspeaking.com/tips.
That's a wrap of another episode of Public Speaking with Peter George. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tune in Monday when you'll hear another episode of Public Speaking with Peter George, and again Thursday for your next episode of Quick Bites, public speaking tips and techniques you can digest in 5 minutes or less. Until next time, remember, when it comes to speaking in public, you've got this.